Hey audio nerds, it's great to see you all again, and look, I haven't got a new product to show you today, so this is going to be the first in a series of videos looking at my favourite music from the last 30 years. Unbelievably, I turned 15 30 years ago, and it was the first time I started really getting into decent music as opposed to terrible music. By the way, if I ever get to 10k subscribers, I'll tell you what the first album I ever bought was. It's quite embarrassing, don't worry. So hit that sub button if you haven't done it already. So for me, 30 years ago, 1991 was ground zero music-wise. It's where it all began. So here's how it works. For each video, I will choose a year and then pick my top 10 albums from that year. As a general rule, my tastes don't veer too far from the mainstream, and I'm sure you will be familiar with many of the albums that I'll be talking about today, as well as in future editions. But hopefully I may also turn you on to some lesser known musical gems that might have passed you by. So most of my picks will be from the world of rock, alternative and indie artists, with a healthy dose of electronic music thrown in for good measure. Let's rewind the musical clock and go back to where it all began for me, 1991. Now the first 7 are in no particular order. I love them all equally, but the top 3 I will rank. So first up we have this beauty. It is of course Loveless by My Bloody Valentine, or MBV for short. Now if you've never heard of them, MBV are a legendary indie band who in the late 80s and early 90s almost single-handedly invented a new genre called shoegaze, characterized by multiple layered guitars, heavy use of the effects and distortion pedals, and somewhat indistinct vocals. Loveless sounds like a total sensory assault on first listen. Keep going though and you'll soon appreciate the subtle melodies and gorgeous textures that there are on this album, sometimes so much so that it's hard to believe that guitars can be made to sound like this. There are 2 vocalists, Kevin Shields and Belinda Butcher, but it's often absolutely impossible to tell which one of them is singing. This album works really well on headphones, although you need a decently resolving pair like my Sundaras to be able to pick apart the many layers of complexity. And don't blame me if by the end of the album your head is spinning faster than the CD. Now my favourite version of this album is this, the 2011 20th anniversary reissue, and it sounds gorgeous, but just bear in mind that all the MBV albums have recently been reissued on vinyl as well. So next we change tack completely for this, The Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest. Now this album contains some of the smoothest and undeniably fluid rapping ever committed to record. Our 2 heroes, Phife Dawg and Q-Tip, trade verses with almost telepathic ease, playing off each other so well, each showcasing different aspects of the young black experience in early 90s America. Yes, there's plenty of boastful bragging of course, and some griping about the music industry as you'd expect, but it's all delivered with poise, intelligence and poetry, and the overall effect is vital and life-affirming. The musical backing, on the other hand, is, shall we say, minimalistic, but it complements the rapping brilliantly, with most of the tracks featuring bass lines played on an acoustic double bass and sparsely sprinkled samples. It feels like a really intimate rap album, more so than most, with an irresistible groove pulsing through it, but it remains for me the high water mark of early 90s rap music. Okay, time to head to Chicago next, as we witness the birth of a 90s rock monster, namely the Smashing Pumpkins. Now that album is of course GISH, and it's criminally overlooked. GISH was recorded at the beginning of the whole grunge phenomenon, but this is definitely not a grunge album. It takes its cues more from classic rock and prog rock than punk. GISH is replete with intricate guitar solos, varied instrumental textures, and somewhat oblique and, to be honest with you, sixth form lyrics. From the outset, Smashing Pumpkins were driven by their control freak, neurotic band leader Billy Corgan, back when he was a little bit slimmer than he is today and had hair. This is an album that showcases perfectly the band's mastery over musical light and shade, and they totally perfect the loud, quiet, loud dynamic on this record. There are some slightly more trippy, almost psychedelic moments on this album, and some moments of real beauty such as Crush and the final track My Daydream. Now it's true that their next album, Siamese Dream, which we might be seeing later in this series, would really see them hit the big time, but I think Gish has really stood the test of time too, and it's one of the most fully formed debut albums of the decade. If you can get hold of this, the original 1991 CD release, do it, because it has an incredible dynamic range and still sounds brilliant. We can't ignore the massive influence of Seattle in 1991, so let's check out 10 by Pearl Jam, probably one of the most famous records to come out of that scene. Now, many people at the time saw Pearl Jam as Nirvana light, all the power but none of the passion, but I'm sorry to say that they were just completely plain wrong. Pearl Jam's focus on musicianship and their respect for classic rock sounds resulted in this awesome album with some unstoppable singles. Some of the subject matter on this album makes for slightly uncomfortable listening, concerning as it does troubled youths, self-doubt, introspection and the like. Introspection was all the rage in 1991, by the way, particularly for moody teenagers like me. But the tunes and the choruses on this record are unstoppable. I dare you not sing along to Alive, Even Flow or Go, the singles. The album is anthemic to many of my generation. Although the original 1991 master is fine, and that's the one I've got here, I actually prefer the 2008 Brendan O'Brien mix, which cleans up the mix a little and brings up some hidden textures while remaining true to the spirit of the original. On to a couple of absolute bangers from the UK next, and first up we have the joyous genre-defying alt-rock, dance, electronic, gospel and rock and roll chemically fueled masterpiece, which is this Primal Scream's Screamadelica. Now this cover alone is iconic. Posters featuring this album cover could be found adorning pretty much any student dorm room circa 1991. Being a hitherto little known minority appeal Scottish indie band, Primal Scream hit the big time by enlisting the help of dance producer Andy Weatherall on this album, and this changed up their sound completely. The result of this collaboration was two absolutely massive singles, Come Together and Loaded, which appealed to both the house music crowd, indie kids, as well as rock fans all at once. But look beyond the singles and there is some seriously trippy and beautifully fragile stuff on this album, including my personal highlight, Higher Than the Sun, which is probably the nearest you can and should get to having a musical acid trip. From the moment the opening riff to moving on up blasts out of your speakers, you know you're in for an absolutely amazing time. Also from the UK is Massive Attack's Blue Lines, which is again a genre-defining masterpiece with a particularly singular vision. Now, Massive Attack hail from Bristol in the southwest of England, and Blue Lines was perhaps the first landmark album of what came to be known as trip-hop. This was a style that combined elements of dub music with a very British take on hip-hop, sometimes featuring soulful vocals from the likes of soul legend Horace Andy and up-and-coming diva Shara Nelson. But the production is absolutely razor sharp. Now the singles such as the opener Safe From Harm and Unfinished Sympathy are perhaps the most well-known cut, but I particularly like the intricate chugging raps such as Five Man Army, featuring classy vocal interplay between 3D, Daddy G and the then little-known young rapper Tricky. This album sounds as fresh and crisply produced in 2021 as it did 30 years ago. Go check it out if you haven't already. It's an absolute banger. Next up, it's time to rock out with those crazy guys with socks on their cocks. Yes, it's the almost totally penis-obsessed Blood Sugar Sex Magic by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. There are the rap rock numbers featuring vocalist Anthony Kiedis enthusiastically boasting about his sexual prowess. See Suck My Kiss and Give It Away in particular, and also Sir Psycho Sexy, which is essentially just a frat boy wet dream set to music. However, there are also some fantastically introspective and somewhat tender and heartfelt delicate ballads. Songs such as I Should Have Lied and particularly Under the Bridge, which is probably one of my top 10 songs of all times. The band really display a new level of musical maturity and prowess on this album, whether it's Flea's increasingly virtuoso bass playing or John Frusciante's textured, understated guitar work. Notably, the original 1991 CD release, does not suffer from the awful production that would characterize some of the Chili Peppers' later albums, such as Californication and By the Way. I can criticize this album in terms of its slightly tedious running time and somewhat dubious and dated lyrical content. However, you can't deny that it's terrific fun and quite catchy, and I still think it hangs together particularly well 30 years later. Okay, so that was the first 7, and we're heading into the top 3 now. So in third place, and as a mark of how successful so-called alternative music had become by 1991, is this, which is Out of Time by REM. Out of Time carried the 4-piece from Athens, Georgia, well into the mainstream. REM, remember, were the quintessential 80s college radio band, but they had a secret weapon in the form of the enigmatic and sexually ambiguous frontman Michael Stipe, whose darkly angelic vocals imbued all REM songs with added layers of intrigue. Now, Out of Time is probably their most pop album, featuring as it does Shiny Happy People, which I know gets up plenty of people's noses, but hey, you were never meant to take it that seriously. The heart of the album lies in the darker stuff, however, in tracks such as Low and particularly Country Feedback, which is my personal highlight. Stipe's previously mumbled lyrics are front and centre in the mix here, as he meditates on time, memory, love and identity as his band conjures mainly acoustic soundscapes featuring such rock and roll instruments as, the mandolin. For the first time ever, REM enlisted some guest vocalists, and Out of Time features both a cool rap from KRS-One on the opening track, as well as a couple of tracks where the B-52's Kate Pearson's vocals blend beautifully with those of Michael Stipe. Despite the more introspective songs, this is probably REM's brightest and most accessible album, and although I'd argue that their next album, Automatic for the People, is the true masterpiece, this one deserves your attention too. Hey, you even get a Mike Mills vocal on Near Wild Heaven. Bonus! You might be surprised then that the album in second place is this, Nevermind by Nirvana. What can I say about this record that hasn't been said before? It's probably the one album out of all these 10 which changed my life completely at the time and shaped my musical outlook more than any other. Listening to it again, as I frequently do these days, I must admit, it's still astonishing to hear these songs which effortlessly combine the raw power of hardcore with melodic and unforgettable songwriting. Although the blueprint had been set with the even rawer predecessor Bleach, Nevermind fully realised Kurt Cobain's incredible vision. There is a primal energy to this album which stems not just from Cobain's astonishing vocal roar, but also from Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic's spine-snapping rhythm section. Smells Like Teen Spirit still has the power to get you screaming along to it and does not suffer from over-familiarity. Come As You Are, Breed, Lithium and Drain You all still kick so hard, and the acoustic poly still sounds harrowingly haunted and bereft. The record was famously produced by Butch Vig, who gave it a slick, slightly corporate rock sheen, which Cobain tried to stamp all over by hiring the altogether less polished Steve Albini to produce their next album, In Utero. I think the production is the only thing that makes Nevermind sound a little bit of its time, and it would have been fascinating to hear a slightly grittier production. However, that cannot eclipse the essential genius on display here. This is ultimately an uplifting record, a rallying cry to disaffected Generation X kids like me everywhere. That's absolutely what it felt like at the time. It was life-changing, and every time I listen to Nevermind now, I am a crazy flannel shirt wearing 15-year-old once again, screaming along to the chorus of Lithium. So that brings us to my top choice, and what could possibly be better than Nevermind? Well, interestingly, I didn't like this album as much as some of the others I've mentioned when it was first released. However, since then and over the course of the last 30 years, it has grown in stature and relatability for me, and it's none other than Achtung Baby by U2. At the time, in 1990, U2 were coming off their Rattle and Hum tour with its accompanying album being widely seen as their worst release to date, and critics and the public alike were totally over U2's obsession with retro American music styles and heroes of the past. they were accused of unoriginality and even worse, of flagrant cultural appropriation. So the Irish four-piece totally ripped up their formula and retreated, as David Bowie had done, to Hansa Studios in Berlin to seek inspiration and a new direction. The album that followed, Achtung Baby, represents one of the boldest reinventions of the modern era musically. Gone was the earnest, po-faced U2 that we'd grown accustomed to, and what emerged was an altogether darker, more adventurous and far more humorous band, which for the first time didn't take itself so seriously. To accompany the new image, we got a whole new sound, with the songs embracing emerging dance and electronic elements. Lead single The Fly was a perfect introduction to the new U2, featuring as it does a squalling metallic guitar line from The Edge and heavily processed drums, whilst Bono's half-whispered vocals erupt into a falsetto for the run-up to the unstoppable chorus. Yes, this was definitely U2 in uncharted territory. Achtung Baby was recorded soon after the Berlin Wall came down, and there's a real sense of fresh possibility all over this album, echoing the monumental events taking place in Europe at the time. Now, there are too many highlights to mention them all, but my picks include the taut and somewhat emotional Until the End of the World, which is either about the Edge's divorce or about Judas's betrayal of Jesus. The album closer, Love is Blindness, is hauntingly downbeat and intimate, and of course One, the song which set millions of lighters waving aloft in stadiums around the world, is perhaps their most anthemic and universal song. Achtung Baby is the perfect synthesis of the old and new U2. Both in terms of its vision and sheer musical brilliance, Achtung Baby remains U2's greatest achievement, and it is my favourite album of 1991. So there it is, folks, there's a list. There were, of course, some great albums that didn't quite make the cut, such as Metallica's Black Album. If you can think of any other albums from 1991 that you would have liked to have seen included, let me know in the comments section below. I hope you enjoyed that video. It was a bit different from the usual stuff, wasn't it? We even got a different desk look, way. But anyway, keep watching for more great content coming up soon. Stay safe, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye for now.